in case all right, in case all this looks a little bit clumsy, just remember we converted the license. I just think we're getting a few kinks out, that's all. All right. All right, so efficient and economic HF antenna solutions. And I think I'm fairly knowledgeable about antennas, but I'm definitely qualified to give this presentation because I'm cheap. So really, stuff has gone out of sight for hardware. Thank God I have a big inventory of wires, antenna tuners, insulators, center insulators, because man, stuff's gotten out of sight. I predict in time, because really, you know, there is competition in the ham market. Some of this stuff will come back to reality, but in the short term, we're dealing with some mighty expensive stuff. So one of my themes here is to avoid spending more money than you need to on antennas. Right? Couple of things. Like I say, I'm qualified. I've said that anyone that knows me hears me say this all the time. My daddy was an accountant. He taught me how to make money, and he also taught me how to not give it to other people. All right. So here's the basic whole tenet of the presentation. We're going to cover some interesting topics in here, but it's more to motivate people to think in terms of building their own when possible, and also to take into consideration what you have at your disposal in terms of the qualities of your lot and how that drives the selection of appropriate antennas. Really, that second comment in there comes with a message. This is the one about high price does not necessarily mean better performance. What I mean by that, though, is there's a lot of antennas out there that in their own way, for the purposes they're designed for, are damn good antennas, and they're worth the money. However, if they're built for special purpose, they may not give you as good a performance return for your buck as just a regular generic solution that people have been using for years. That's really a proven commodity. Now, I'm just going to give you one quick example, although I don't want anyone to jump to the conclusion that I think this guy is overcharging or that he doesn't make a good product. But here's a classic example. I can build the standard 125-foot doublet cut for 80 meters that covers 80 through 10. I can add the cost of an automatic antenna tuner to that at $300, okay? And guess what? I'll still be under the cost of a deluxe buddy pole configuration. This is just offered as an example, but it's just trying to illustrate where I'm going with this. And there's nothing wrong with the buddy pole line of stuff. The guy makes good stuff. I'll also comment that I've heard over the years that if you call him and you just say, hey, look, fella, I'm the old military vet without a lot of spare cash. Hell, the guy will help you fabricate a buddy pole using your own parts. It's a good guy. He makes a good product. But the whole point is, it's a little bit more money than you need to pay if you're looking for a basic, standard, good performing antenna for the bucks. And what it all boils down to is, before, if as a rookie, you want to invest any money, you need to enlist the assistance of someone that knows what they're doing. And it starts with someone who's done it before, literally looking at the lot capabilities that you have. You got to find the right person though. Ultimately, though, your lot characteristics are going to determine what antennas are available. And hopefully you've got an advantageous lot. We'll talk about Elon's lot as we near the end of the presentation, compare it to my lot, compare it to what Maurice has to work with. And in that discussion, we're just going to center on the notion of, given the limitations or the advantages of what we got, what's going to work and give us the best results for the least amount of money. If you're a rookie, then let me give you the following advice. When in doubt, ask around at your club. Find out who's capable of really advising you on antennas. Now, just an observation. If you're in SARA, you want to ask me. Not that there's not a couple other people that are in a position to help you, but I love going out and looking at lots. I'm also the guy that operates the tennis ball cannon, all right? But I will tell you something. If you're recently inducted ham, whatever the hell you do, don't take as an expert opinion something from another ham that just came on the air a year ago. There's more misinformation and misassumptions out there than you can believe when it comes with respect to antennas. You want to find someone experienced. Now, I hate to christen somebody for an assignment over at GDARC. My counterpart on an informal basis, but I don't know that he does this on a formal basis, would be Hugo. And half the stuff I've learned about antennas, I've either gotten from him initially or it's as a result of reviewing configurations and suggestions with him. He's equally good, but I don't know whether anyone's really designated him for the role. If you're someone watching this remote, though, ask around at your club who the senior antenna guy is. It's well worth the money. All right. What do we provide as a club? If you're new to the club or you just are not aware of the services we offer, a lot of clubs complain about a lack of elm ring for their members. In our case, we do our damnedest to make sure our starting members get the best information they can about antennas, get an analysis of their property situation, get some concrete suggestions as how to proceed, and then we can show up with the tennis ball cannon, using the ability to put up the support lines for the antenna and get them up very high. So remember, a basic lot review and me assisting you putting up the first antenna is something that we do not charge for to a brand new member. And actually, me just working with anyone that's just trying to optimize their situation or switching over from, say, VHF only to HF, we're more than willing to help with, and that comes with the membership cost. I just want to step aside for a second, though, and put on my treasurer's cap. We're facing a repair job with the tennis ball cannons. Both of them are in need of some repair. I would like to do one of them this year. The board has authorized me to spend the money, and we have it, but to be honest with you, this is kind of a special appropriation, and I'd rather subsidize it by hitting up the next 4 or 5 people calling me out that are existing members that have used the services before to help kick in a couple extra bucks. That'll be strictly voluntary to just help defray the cost of fixing the tennis ball cannon. But in the end, the mentoring services are free. And I would suggest any new member or any existing member who's still dubious about their antenna situation, take advantage of it. Other thing is, I'm working with Elon right now, and some of the considerations that we have or conclusions we've come to based on his property layout are going to be part of the presentation here. Frankly, I started with him because he's got the most interesting layout of anybody. But if you're interested in having me come out for any of the antenna services, get your name on the waiting list. I've had a lot of personal stuff to get out of the way. Weather's improving, and I got to tell you, March, as long as the days aren't windy, can be a great time to shoot. So if you're expecting me to help you out, do me a favor, sign up. What's the only requirement? I'm looking for members who pay their dues. If you haven't paid your dues, the first question I'm going to ask you as your treasurer is, hey, I'm looking at the worksheet. I don't see your check yet. It's fair warning. But I don't think that's an unreasonable request to make as a prerequisite for the services. Let's talk about life in New England. Again, lot considerations, surface features of the property, soil conductivity are all contributors to what makes a good antenna based on your locale, and possibly favors one type of antenna obviously over another. Our disadvantages: we get snow, we get ice, we get a lot of high winds. Wire antennas are casualties of the tops of trees being ripped off, trees coming up by the trunk, and branches falling on tree limbs. It's what you deal with in New England. My solution, by the way, that anyone that says it's a challenge to put up a horizontal antenna and keep it up at a high altitude in these parts, I would agree. And I would say, get used to using your soldering iron. And there are mechanisms, they're not going to be covered here, that do give you the ability to protect your antennas. Some of the old-fashioned solutions like suspending your antenna support lines with bleach bottles to allow for some sway in the antenna when the wind blows and the limbs go back and forth. Now, everybody says this across the country, but this is especially true of New England. It's kind of a joke, but it's really true. If you ever watch trees in the middle of the storm, most storms around here deal with swirling winds, and I kid you not. If you have a dipole, the limbs are never going to sway in the same direction at the same time. Most of the time, they're going to sway, in fact, in the opposite direction, and you have to be prepared for that. What do we have going in our advantages? Oh, let's just talk about the soil conductivity, though, for just a second. The ability of a radio to interact with the soil in New England is probably as bad as it is anywhere across the entire country. This is what generally tends to make vertical antennas a little bit less viable around here than they are in some other parts of the country. You will hear me trash people who immediately look to a vertical as a solution in these parts, but it doesn't mean I'm necessarily philosophically against verticals. But multi-band verticals, for instance, tend to be very expensive, and frankly, around here, they don't work all that well. However, if it's your only alternative because you have no trees or available supports, there's some good ones out there, and they can give you some basically good return. We'll discuss Maurice's situation as we conclude the presentation just to see how effectively he's used verticals. Hint, Dr. Maurice lives on Japan. It's as simple as that. What are the other advantages, though? We got the best trees in the country. I mean, other than California, where the guys from NorCal who built our antenna ball cannons and designed them in the first place have sequoias and redwood trees at 300 feet. I'll tell you what, you're not likely to beat the scenarios that we get around here, where we get oaks that are as high as 100 feet and tulip trees that go up to 100, 150, 175 feet. And the trees have been growing for years. They really haven't been doing much commercial lumbering of oak trees. All right, so the advantage it gives us is the ability, using, for instance, our tennis ball cannon, to get some horizontal antennas up in the air that can be really fine performers at the proper altitude, but are kind of mediocre if you don't get them up to that altitude. Any of the antennas we're going to discuss are going to have the basic characteristics that they're capable of being built, and there's not much skill required to do so. Inexpensive, especially if you know where to obtain the parts. Let me just deal with that for a second. There's antenna wire out there. Some of it is very good. I'll give you an example. Ilan and I have been looking at using Polyphase 13, which is a copper-clad steel with some superior insulation that is as strong as all get out. And I have seen this stuff hold up tree limbs that have been separated from the trunks of trees. The stuff is great, but at 30 cents a foot, it can be a little excessive. Classic example as a counter to that is you walk over to Home Depot. Now, God help us, their prices have really skyrocketed. But I'll tell you what, their standard number 12 gauge or number 14 gauge, depending upon the length of the antenna, stranded wire is good enough to do the job for most antennas. A lot of the secret, though, of the antennas I'm going to talk is you've got to have the lot size. If you have it, you go with it. If you don't have the lot size, we'll talk about alternatives. Remember, though, the general theme that we're supposed to be builders. There's not a lot left that you can do in ham radio in terms of building rigs, for instance. Basically, surface mount technology produces a better rig than you could ever build by hand. Antennas are one of the last remaining residual parts of ham radio where home brew is a great idea and can save you a ton of money. That's why we so encourage newcomers to basically master that theme and make antennas by themselves. We got some classic antennas here. So the theme here is what's simple, what's inexpensive to build in the single band antenna range. Hear me out. When you start a discussion with a novice with respect to what bands do you want to operate on, a lot of times you're going to get an immediate response of, well, I want all of them. And the standard HF bands are typically going to be 80 through 10. A lot of what I'm going to say, though, in the short term is going to focus on, say, 160, 80, 40, and 20, which really could entertain some very simplistic antennas. A lot of times, as you guys are aware, 20, 15, 10, they're considered to be the domain of beams. I wouldn't say that 100%, but that's why I'm sort of emphasizing the 160 to 20 meter bands. But we'll talk about all band scenarios as well. The classics, the dipole antenna. We'll discuss it in a minute. It's the most underrated antenna in ham radio if it's properly executed. Simple wire verticals. What I mean by that is verticals just using regular wire without aluminum, suspended from trees with elevated radials for a single band. They're a nice solution. And also the use of the vertical loop, which really is a second cousin of a simple wire vertical. So if you break it down, we'll start with the dipole, and I'm not exaggerating. People piss on dipoles all the time because they don't understand the importance of the height of the dipole. All right. If you can get a dipole up to a half wavelength or more in height, they are a great antenna, and they put out a great signal broadside to the antenna. I kid you not, though, in a very eye-opening survey that the ARRL did starting a couple decades ago, in which they repeat with all the surveys that you send into them, here's a finding that'll blow your mind. The average height of a horizontal antenna across all hams in the United States is only 30 feet. A dipole at 30 feet for 40, 80, or 160 is not an especially good antenna. On 20 meters, though, at 30 feet, it's close to being a half wavelength, and you're starting to see some real selectivity in terms of being able to point the antenna. Now, again, what's the advantage the club has? Well, we've got trees. We've got the tennis ball cannon to shoot the line over the trees. Now, I see the names of a couple people that may have never seen me fire off this tennis ball cannon at field day. And so if you're new to the whole thing and you're looking for an example of how good they are, well, I need both guns to be resealed because they're leaking a little bit. But when they're charged to full capacity, they can throw a tennis ball over a sequoia or a redwood tree in California up to a distance of 275 to 300 feet. They're that good. I ask anyone that watches this on field day, and probably the funnest aspect of field day, other than the operating, is to just watch me hitting the crotches of trees with that thing. We've gotten to be quite good with it over the years. That's what gives us the advantage that we have. Here's a little chart that if a lot more people would pay attention to, would realize that dipole is a good antenna, but height can be an issue. So let's review this. We're talking about basically center frequency operation. I mean, I'm just picking standard frequencies across the bands. But we've got the length that is dictated for the dipole based on the frequency. We've also got the height recommendation. And just remember, we use two separate calculations, if you remember this for your exam, because a half wavelength dipole is subject to largely being a little bit shorter based on the capacitance, I believe, it's induced by the use of insulators. And also the 492 measurement, I think, is a more theoretical measurement based on free space. That's why you're seeing the different figures. Here's the point. For a dipole cut to 3775, the anticipated length is about 124 feet. That may differ for reasons I'll discuss. The height requirement for a dipole at a half wavelength to make it really fire, be really directional, and have some guy in Europe hear you with even 100 watts is 130 feet. That is the configuration that I'm using, but my lot contributes to it. We'll get back and look at that in just a couple minutes. Go down to 40, though, and you know what? Things start to get really practical. If you have a couple oak trees, you have a couple maple trees in the backyard, we need about 75 feet because there's always going to be some drooping in the middle of the antenna. All right. The thing is, though, the antenna length for the dipole is going to be about 66 feet, right? We need to get up to a height of approximately 69 feet. But I'll tell you what, guys, if you get within 10 to 15 feet of a half wavelength, you're still going to get some pretty easily recognized directivity. It's just a half wavelength is really the trick. Now, get to 40 meters. Only 33 feet is required. Remember, you can be plus or minus a few feet. Hey, if the standard average length is a ham, or height for a ham is 30 feet, you're looking good for 20-meter dipole. Or, I'm sorry, the requirement being 34.5 feet, you're getting there. 15 meters, 22 feet in length, 23.15, easily done. Same thing for 10 meters. I like the dipole as a solution, and people piss on it regularly. A lot of people that piss on it regularly are the newcomers that have no idea how good an antenna it is when installed at the proper height. Let me give you some examples of this. A lot of people will throw math at you. I'm just going to try and put this in a language all of us can understand based on configurations I've used. And what's the nice thing about the dipole? They're cheap to build. We'll give you some cost estimates in a minute. And because they're cheap to build, if you have a lot that humors it and you want to have some real fun, do what I do on 40 meters. I have a set of oak trees available to me that can basically accept a dipole that is firing broadside at Europe and a separate dipole firing broadside down to South America, up to Canada, and over the poles. It's a great arrangement. Now, the thing is, in theory, for a 40-meter dipole, we'd really like to have it up at around 70 feet. These guys are up at around 50 feet, but remember, I live on a hill. And essentially, in 3 of the directions, there's a downward slope from the plateau that my house sits on. So what's the net result of 2 specifically pointing dipoles up at around 50 feet? Pretty decent coverage in Europe, guys. Now, you have to understand that European hams on 40 meters put up with a lot of local interference. It's a very popular band over there. It's hard to find a clear spot. Sometimes what appears to be a dead band on our side of 40, because we don't hear anybody, is a band that doesn't have a single available open segment for another QSL, because on the other side, the Europeans are using every one of the frequencies. On a clear night, this configuration, when pointed to Europe, will get me a 5.9 routinely. If there's interference, I may have to repeat the call 3 to 4 times, and the European may express his impatience by knocking me down to a 5.7. But no kidding, I reliably worked Europe all the time with this configuration. And on the dipole facing down to South America and the Caribbean, 5.9 all the time on 40 meters, because there's not a lot of congestion down there. Are you beginning to see the relationship really between the height and the quality of what it's going to do for you? The nice thing about it too, guys, is if you're new to antennas, there's nothing like doing the A/B switching test back and forth between the 2 antennas. In this case, I could see mild directional differences between the 2 antennas, but they were mild. They weren't night and day. Okay. Again, 70 feet is perfect, but hey, if you can get it up 55, 60 feet on 40 meters, you're doing good. Let me tell you what I did for Winter Field Day this year. Funny story. So I operated between my property and my mother-in-law's property with my took-us over at my mother-in-law's to reach the 30 foot away from your permanent station rule. I've got a huge oak tree in Scalzi Park that is a nice configuration to work with a huge oak tree on my property that goes 85 to 90 feet up and put up a dipole for 40 meters to sweep the eastern seaboard up at 70 feet. One of the things that happens, though, when you work a nice casual contest like Winter Field Day, is you got a lot of the guys out there that are actually simulating emergency conditions, and you got a lot of marginal hams that made some antenna mistakes and put up some pretty marginal antennas who are on the air and they're trying to work stations. What did a dipole on 40 meters at 70 feet get me consistently up and down the entire eastern seaboard? Reports like, you're the loudest signal on the band, or you're one of the 5 loudest signals in the band. What are you using for an antenna? You're banging in here. I'm not exaggerating. That's how good a dipole can work when you put it up at the proper height. All right, I'll go with my 80-meter example. In a way, this is even more fun because we're trying to really combine multiple factors here to try to explain why I get out so well at 80 meters. Now, first off, let me tell you that my permanent antenna pointed to Europe is what we would call a doublet antenna. And you can go into raging debates about the difference between a doublet and a dipole, but describing an antenna as a doublet is a little bit more generic a description. We're going to discuss this specific type of doublet that I'm using that's suspended between 2 trees on my neighbor's property, mind you, that's pointed towards Europe. If you want to use good wire effective antennas, make friends with all your neighbors and be prepared to do the multiple favors. I do it all the time. But now let me get to the performance of that antenna when I put it up for contest purposes. I get 5.9 signal reports in the middle of contest weekends from European operators regularly. Now, mind you, that's what I'm going with an 80-meter dipole that's about 10 feet higher than the doublet I'm describing. But in routine operations, where there's not much contention for band space, either that doublet or the dipole up another 10 feet higher puts in a rocking signal to Europe. But now hear me out, because let's do some math. What I'm doing is getting that dipole up to around 80 feet. Look at the formula. It says to get the kind of results I'm getting, I should be at 130 feet. But what does my lot contribute that makes both antennas such outstanding performance? Well, you ever been to where I live? I am on a hill in back of Scalzi Park. I'm approximately, depending upon which portion of the park you look at, as high on average as about 50 feet over most of the parts of Scalzi my signal is going to travel across. In addition, when my signal hits the plateau beneath the hill that comprises Scalzi Park, it makes for a nice, consistent takeoff to most portions of the world. The only issue I've got is that I live on the side of a hill where the upper portion of the hill interposes between me and the West Coast.
On fire right now.
Oh, no.
That can be a pain, but you got to live with your consequences of your lot. And I do speak to the West Coast all the time. I just don't get out in that direction as well as I otherwise could. But now look at the formula. Take 80 feet of raw height provided by those trees, add the 50 feet of elevation that I get by being on the hill, I get an effective height of that dipole.
In the summer, you'd be against it.
No.
That's why it gets out to Europe as well as it does.
Such an old man with big bellies.
If someone who's talking will put yourself on mute, I'd appreciate it. But now let's talk money, because that's what this presentation is all about. A twin dipole configuration will not cost you a lot of money and can make you a lot of contacts. So let's talk about what went in to my twin 40-meter dipole configuration. It was based on using that THHN stranded number 14 gauge wire from Home Depot. 68 feet of that was about $8. Now, mind you, be prepared for that to go up to maybe $10 because all the wire at Home Depot is going up by the week. All right. Just putting that in as a starting point. Every dipole needs a center insulator. I like the Budwig center insulators. I use them all the time. The cost of the Budwig, which is reasonably priced, and 2 ceramic end insulators will run you $22, multiple vendors on eBay. Now, that's the inherent cost of the antenna. But the thing is, I'm trying to give you a comprehensive solution. If we're going to have a 2 dipole configuration, we need 2 runs, minimally, of 100 foot of RG8X coax. With the PL259s attached, God bless them, over in China, they turn these out by the zillion now. You can pick them up for $45 a pop, and they have reinforced insulators on the PL259 connectors that I really love. They're a decent buy. So what are we talking? Each of those 2 dipoles cost me, or would cost me, we'll build again today, $75 a pop, but that includes its own coax feeder. Again, that 2 40-meter dipole configuration, right? A total of $150. I got a great signal to Europe, got a great signal to South America. You may too, if you're in an ideal lot situation. We've got a similar scenario. It's possible for 20 meters, and it will work surprisingly well. Remember, you'd only have to get it up to around maybe 27 to 30 feet, right? I mean, 35 would be ideal. But because you're using less wire, you could probably do a configuration like that for about $120. And you would notice a distinct difference in the directionality of the 2 dipoles and get out very well. So much for the notion that these guys are less than optimal antennas that should not be considered. But now I just want to extrapolate an estimate for building one 80-meter dipole. I'll tell you guys that you've got to have a pretty good lot to justify putting up more than one 80-meter dipole, because again, you've got to get it up pretty high to really get a lot of directionality. If you've got an 80-meter dipole up around 60 feet, you're not going to hear a heck of a lot of difference in the continental United States. One signal as opposed to the other based on where they're located. It pretty much becomes almost omnidirectional at high angles. Now, again, we're just reviewing the standard prices. It's going to take a little bit more wire. But when you all add it up, well, what are we talking about? $90 per dipole, and typically one will meet your needs for the average HF operator. All right, that's it for the dipole. And for just a minute, I want to talk about single band wire ground plane verticals. I come down pretty hard later on in this presentation on multi-band verticals. There's nothing inherently wrong with the way the manufacturers make them. There's nothing unfair about the prices they charge for them, but we're trying to optimize bang for the buck. And my whole point about single or multi-band verticals is they are useful when you have no other options. If you have other options, and if you're someone that focuses on a single band, and for a lot of folks that are past their intermediate steps in ham radio, they tend to pick a band they like. Well, this is when you may want to consider as another arrow in your quiver, even to supplant your existing dipole, putting up a ground plane vertical. They tend to be good for DX, but they also tend to be very noisy. again, to make the list, right? They have the characteristics. They're economical, they're easy to build, they're good for DX, though they're a little noisy. Look at the formulas for just a second. So, sideband, right? On 75, we're talking 62 feet. Center of the sideband or center of the band on 40, approximately 33 feet. 20 meters, 17 feet. How do you make these guys? You dangle them from trees. You make them out of 14 gauge wire, 12 gauge wire, either suitable. You're also going to be using, if you follow my recommended configuration, elevated radials, which are a little bit less effort if you have the room to put them up, and you also have a yard safe from people running around on mini bikes or motorcycles or bicycles or what have you, right? But if you can pull it off, they give you good antenna. And in the New England area, the elevated radials tend to work a little bit better than buried radials on the ground. Added to the cost of the wire is the fact that usually you will buy a choke balun to keep common mode interference from coming in on your coax, or you may buy a 2-to-1 balun to do, or a 1-to-2 balun to do the up conversion of the natural impedance of a ground plane vertical, which can sometimes be in the low 20s, and bump it up so it's a good match to 52 ohm coax. All right. Here's the thing. These guys tend to be a little bit more wide-banded than dipoles. So one of the nicer things about operating with a vertical 180 is just about all the frequencies I typically need to cover can be covered off the vertical. Because again, it's got about 50% wider bandwidth typically than what you get with a dipole. Generally speaking, though, when you use one of these guys, you will either have a simple matching network that you make that resides at the bottom of the antenna. So you set it to a starting reference frequency and then do the tuning inside on your rig. Or you're really smart and you've got a spare tuner. What I do when I put up these verticals on a temporary basis for contesting is you put your automatic tuner right at the base of the vertical and you get a really good performing, really broadbanded antenna. These guys can really, really work out well. Really a close relative of the vertical antenna that I just described, so basically the ground plane with the elevated radials, is its second cousin, the vertical loop. And in the opinions of some, it's a lot easier antenna to deal with, though in raw size, it can be kind of intimidating. These guys are also excellent low band, or excuse me, low angle radiators, which means they're good for DX. They also tend to be a lot lower noise than their straight vertical cousins, and sometimes are a lower noise than dipoles. Formula for cutting, you remember this for your exam, 1005 over the frequency in megahertz, which will give you around 266 feet for 80. By the way, that's my loop. I get a loop on 80. About 140 on 7.15, and for 20 meters, it's a very reasonable 70.53 feet. There's a lot of mythology about loops, so let me tell you something. As long as the ends of the loop are connected, in other words, it's one continuous wire, all you have to do is put it in what I would call a closed configuration that opens up or covers as much geography as you can, and any shape will do. The optimum shape, by the way, and very few people realize this, of one of these loops is circular. That's what the US military proved over the years. God help you putting in enough support line to make the loop circular, though. So for most people, it will be rectangular, triangular, typically. I've got kind of a compromise, though, because my oak tree doesn't have a correspondingly large tree on the other side of my property. So if I had to describe to you my loop, it is a 3-sided triangle loop where none of the sides equal any of the other sides. It's very odd and squat looking, but you know what? It works like a son of a bitch. And because vertical loops tend to be very broadbanded, as long as you have a good homemade matching transformer that you made out of 75 ohm coax, and you can show anybody how to do it, it's not hard, or you buy a loop balun, because a loop's inherent impedance is going to come in at around 110 to 120 ohms, that knocks it down to say 52 ohms for a good match to coax, you're going to have a good result. You're going to get out well. But really, the vertical loops are a single band proposition. You can use them on multiple bands, but really on other than the intended design frequency, you're going to get kind of mediocre performance. Although I will tell you that on 20 meters, I sometimes A/B across signals between the loop and maybe an 80-meter dipole or one of my extended double ZEPs tuned for 20. It does amaze me that occasionally the loop will go bonkers and pull in a signal that none of the other antennas can hear. That's not unusual with loops. All right. So again, here's just the stats on the balun and the matching section. We're doing the inherent conversion down from say 110, 120 down to 52 ohms so you can match coax. Here's the description of my 80-meter loop. Good results, a total of 266 feet of wire, just as the formula would predict, right? Single support, I just got that 185-foot oak tree. But again, the base of the loop takes advantage of the fact that my plot is 50 feet in elevation up from Scalzi Park in the direction to which it's pointed, which is Europe. Total cost, this is a rough estimate, using current wire prices if you bought them in those 500-foot spools, is the wire is going to run you, along with the matching unit or the balun, depending on which way you want to go, 85 to 125 bucks. It's worth the money. 40 meters, you can get the equivalent for 70 to 110. Now, I know and have been acquainted with the guy that runs high gain antennas for a long time. And he's a good guy. He operates out of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. He makes loops. Now, he'll charge you $140 for a 40-meter loop, but it's well constructed. But I'm trying to point out he's charging you just for the loop. The guy's entitled to his markup. He works hard. But my point is, if you homebrew, you got the money to do the other necessary things, like having a decent external tuner to be able to tune this loop wherever you want to go. All right. Those are some of the standard, really good single band antennas that do not cost a lot of money and are easily built. But now I'm going to go with two of my personal favorites. They require a lot of room, but I'll tell you, they're very inexpensive to build, and they will really put out a good signal. The first one is an extended double ZEP. We've used these guys for field day before, guys, and I've used these on 80 meters, 40 meters, and on 20 meters. They require a lot of room. Typically, they're going to be fed with either 300 or 450 ohm ladder line. Now, in my opinion, either one will do. And because the price of ladder line has skyrocketed on the 450 side as opposed to the 300 side recently, I would just say, unless you're operating a full switch down or key down linear, like 2.5 kilowatts, which you shouldn't be doing, 300 ohm will be fine. It will save you a couple bucks, but either will do. Because of the length and the height requirements, it's difficult to get one up high enough on 80 meters to work effectively. But for 40 meters and 20 meters, these guys are an excellent solution. They'll give you 3 dB gain in the preferred baud side direction for a 30-degree firing angle. It's a lot of gain. You're doubling your output power as opposed to using a dipole. But here's what you need. You need 88 feet in length for the 20-meter version, and you've got to get it up about 45 feet in height. The 40-meter version, typically for center bands, around 174 feet. There is some debate, by the way, over which equation to use in calculating the length. If you want to build one, talk to me. We'll do the math together. You need a minimum of 70 feet, in other words, to get that 3 dB gain if you're using the 40-meter version. What do you need? You need 3 times the wire length of the standard dipole for that same operating frequency, right? Typically. But it's the same couple of insulators you use for dipole. The only difference is you're going to need a specialized central insulator to handle the attachment of the feed line. Typically the ladder lock plastic center insulator that's so famous for the 450 line. DX Engineering makes a couple different products as well that are capable of gracefully supporting the joint point between the window line and the antenna. The half square is my personal favorite. Half square is fed with 52 ohm coax when you use what I'm going to call the standard top fed left corner configuration. Now, discussing a half square takes a lot of time. So what I'm really trying to do is whet your appetite for them. If anyone wants to see more information or have you draw a configuration, it's kind of different. It's difficult to do unless I know what your lot looks like. So that's why you're not seeing a picture. But a half square looks like a rectangle with no bottom wire connecting the 2 vertical sections. That's the way I would describe it. All right. Here's the key. This baby is highly directional. For 40 meters, you only need to put it up at around 40 feet. For 20 meters, you only need to get it up at around 20 feet. For the 80-meter version, you only need to get it up at around 70 feet. These are reasonable height requirements. Again, no radials are required. You've got direct 52 ohm coax feed. These guys are a bargain. I just want to point out something, though, about them that people do not understand. A dipole on 40 pointing in the favored direction at 70 feet is better than a half square. The literature and the explanations tend to get this all wrong. Look carefully at what I say here, which is, it's going to require, or that, let me just rephrase this, I'm going to step back. You get 2 to 3 dB gain over a standard one element vertical set up in a ground plane configuration by using a half square. You follow me? In other words, a half square's got 2 or 3 dB gain over standard vertical. But if you could compare it with a standard dipole up to around 70 feet, the dipole is still going to perform better unless it's extremely long path DX coming in at a very low angle. I will tell you, though, one thing that's really fun about these guys is, because they're cheap, again, running them in a dual configuration where one points to Europe and one points to South America is something I've been doing in contests for years. They get really good results. I will tell you, though, it's a little bit less directional than a dipole. So if you do a lot of A/B switching back and forth between the antennas, you'll see mild differences in directionality. But they give you the ability to point to a preferred area of the world in a manner that does not allow you to do it with a vertical, because a single element vertical is what? It's inherently omnidirectional. That's an advantage if you're looking for a monitoring antenna. But just remember the old adage of people that don't like verticals. Verticals radiate equally poorly in all directions. All right. Let's get into multiband antennas. I've got some strong preferences here, and all I'm trying to do is just introduce you to what I consider to be the 3 standard configurations. The advice I'm going to give you here is that there are all kinds of exotic antennas out there that you can spend a ton of money on. But if you're doing so, you should do it only in the event your lot will not support one of these 3 types of antennas, because they all get out very well, and in many instances will beat the doors off of any antenna that you can buy from any manufacturer anywhere. So the first is the 125-foot doublet that's fed with open wire feeders or ladder line. The next is the horizontal loop. I put up 2 of these for our constituents within the club. I'm going to be putting up a 3rd one for Elon. These babies are awesome. That's all I can tell you. They take a lot of room, but they're awesome for performance. The modern alternative to the 125-foot doublet, which a lot of people have adapted, and which I tend to recommend to beginners that are looking for a good all-around, all-band antenna, that are not real tech-savvy and don't want to build, is the recent emergence of all these off-center fed dipoles, which can be coaxial fed, but get you multiple signals across multiple bands using only the tuner that's associated with your transceiver. Usually those are very limited range tuners. So let's break these guys down. And then what we'll do is sort of a compare and a contrast with, hey, these are the recommendations, but if your lot doesn't support them, what are the alternatives? What justifies spending more money? So here's the classic one. Guys, this has been the classic one since the 1930s. I'm not kidding. The only problem in the old days was antenna tuners, in some instances, used to cost you more than rigs. That's one of the changes that have taken place over the years. Antenna tuners, by comparison, and when you compare them based on time-adjusted dollars for inflation, are a bargain today in terms of what you get. So again, here's the standard assumption. A dipole for mid-range operation in the 75-meter phone band is going to run you about 125 feet. The difference between this 125-foot doublet, though, is it's going to be fed with ladder line. And since it's cut for 80 meters, it will work every ham band from 80 through 10. The principle is you cut it for the lowest band of operation. And then you deal with it through a tuner as required for the other bands that you're going to operate on. Now, tuner prices have gone up, though. So although these are good antennas, they've got a little pricier in execution. And here's why. I have 2 different MFJ tuners in the mid-range that work fine unless you have a linear that I really love. I've used both of them for years. John Sabini can swear by the second one. He uses it all the time. That's what we're using as the basis of our remote antenna. Okay, it's the MFJ 929. Now, son of a gun, they were $229 the last time I looked. Now they're $300 a pop. Also, the MFJ 993B. The last time I looked, that was around $325, $225. They're up to $350. Fred was nice enough to sell me his surplus one about 7, 8 years ago. The thing has been outrageously good. I swear you could get on the air on 80 meters with a butter knife with this thing in terms of matching. God knows if anybody would hear you. But here's the thing. Because of the nature of how the doublet works, you really do need to consider getting an external tuner. The tuning range is going to be tough under certain scenarios. Let me explain why. 125-foot doublet cut for 80 is going to be a tough row to hoe on 40 because you're going to get a high impedance scenario up around 100, 1,000, 1,200, possibly 1,500 ohms. And that is not capable of being supported by the average tuner that comes with the rig. Thus, really, if you're going to go this route today, I recommend an external tuner. You can save a couple bucks by getting a manual tuner, but to get a manual tuner that's really going to do the job, you're going to spend 150 anyway. That's why I recommend spending a few more dollars and getting an automatic version. That's largely up to you. This is a damn good antenna. This will get you DX on the upper DX bands. And here's the thing that's kind of cute about it. When you operate it on 80, it's going to be like a dipole. When you operate it on 40, it's going to behave a little bit like an antenna called a center fed ZEP and actually get you about a dB worth of gain. When you start to transition to 20, 15, and 10, it gets real interesting because the radiation pattern starts to go off at the end of the antennas. It's kind of a magical antenna. Based on which band you're going to be using it on, it may be hitting a completely different portion of the world in terms of its preferred direction. All right, so that's it for the doublet. Now, I want to stop for just a second, though, and mention another kind of antenna that really didn't get in the presentation. In a way, they're kind of obsolete, but they're still out there, and some people use them to good effect, and that's the trap dipole. Back in the 60s, if you were New Ham and you had your basic rig and you wanted to get on the air with all the bands, your buddies would encourage you to just go out and get a trap dipole, where through the traps we manipulate the various sections of wire so the antenna tunes up and radiates fairly efficiently on any one of several bands. That configuration was especially popular in the days when tuners were very expensive. They're no longer very expensive. Their disadvantage is they tend to weigh a lot. So you could end up suspending one of these trap dipoles between 2 oaks at 80 feet and find out that the feed point's at 55 feet because of the inherent weight of all the traps. They still do a good job, but today, as far as I'm concerned, they fit a niche need for getting you on 80 and or 40 meters if you don't have the space for a full-length dipole. For many years, I used an 80-40 trap dipole with approximately 90 feet in length to accommodate the fact that the 2 trees that accommodate my antennas that go north and south are in fact less than the separation distance of a dipole. All right. So my suggestion for trap dipole is leave them for 80 and 40, or for situations where you lack the distance, but there were better alternatives. 125-foot doublet being the best of them all. The horizontal loop. Oh man, this is the creme de la creme. Okay, I did one of these with Dan Schaefer about a year and a half ago. He hasn't stopped talking about it since. And God bless him, Milan, you're the next to go. So here's what's involved with these guys, and here's what you need. If you have the real estate, man, these are the king of the omnidirectional antennas as far as I'm concerned. They have a cult following, but you need some wire, all right? So 160 meters, where you want to start at 160 and work all the bands on up to 10, you're going to need to hang 543 feet of wire in a rectangular configuration. If it can be made square, that's the best configuration, but rectangular to get the length in the end, if you have to. 80 through 10 meters, you need to start off with the standard 80 horizontal loop. length of 266 feet. For 40 meters as your starting point to get you 40 through 10, you're going to need a loop of 140 feet. Altitude, if you can get it up to say 50 feet, 60 feet, or even 70 feet in height, these guys are amazing performers. They do require a lot of wire though. So again, just remember the difference between the amount of wire required for loop as opposed to a dipole is typically going to be about 2.5 times more wire to build a loop for a given band as opposed to building a dipole. Now, I'm throwing the inverted L in here to accommodate the, all right, I've got one tree in my entire yard to hang something. I want a very versatile antenna that gives me the opportunity to do a lot of things. What do you like? It's the antenna called the inverted L. Did a presentation on these guys just a couple of years ago. They're antennas that combine vertical and horizontal sections to give you performance that's similar to verticals on the lower bands when you don't have the absolute altitude required to go with a full length vertical. I use one on 160. I've got 60 25-foot radials. It's total length of 169 feet. It gets like a bandit on 160. If you take that same antenna, instead of using elevated tune radials, drop those radials on the ground. This is an all-purpose, good vertical performer across all bands, and it will cost you next to nothing to build. That's why I like it. Again, anyone wants an interest in this and would like me to show them what my configuration looks like, it's kind of hard to show you in a photograph. I can take you to where I built mine and give you an illustration of what it looks like. The last recommendation I'm going to make is kind of new on the scene, really. And it has to do with many years ago, the company called Radio Works that put out the Carolina Windom. So, guys, we are talking about the world's most frequently erroneously named antenna now, because those guys just picked the name Windom because it kind of sounded cute, and in a way, a very limited way, their antenna kind of resembled an old Windom. The unfortunate thing is most people continue to call these guys Windoms. If you saw what the old-fashioned Windom circa the 1930s looked like, you'd realize none of the antennas people call a Windom or a Windom, they're off-center fed dipoles. That's what they really are. And what distinguishes an off-center fed dipole is we literally don't feed it in the middle. Engineers have used computers to come up with all kinds of design curves, and what they've done is they've come up basically with some cutting calculations for you to put together an off-center fed dipole that will be in a tuning range across all bands except 15 meters, such that you can get the SWR down within the range of the internal tuner of your rig. That's what makes these guys so nice. They're coaxial fed antennas, and anyone that has ever compared trying to get twin lead into your house as opposed to coax will tell you that anything that's coaxially fed is a far lot easier to handle. And again, if we have one that's cut for 160 or 80, and I've got one configured for both, so in other words, I've got both combinations, it'll cover every band from that band on up with the exception of 15 meters. It just so happens 15 meters is in an odd harmonic relationship. And that antenna, although it might get down to say 2 to 1, 2.2 to 1 on all the other bands, will get above about a 3.0 SWR, which unfortunately is beyond the ability of today's internal tuners in your standard rigs to be able to handle. In general, although people will compare the results to a dipole, I will just tell you that if I had my OCF for 80 on the air, pointing in the same direction as my 80-meter dipole, I would hear a slightly better signal in the dipole because it's more directional, and it would be slightly less noisy in the dipole because one of the disadvantages to the OCFs is what we call common mode interference, which will typically result in a slightly noisier antenna. A bunch of companies make these guys. Some make them more than others. The famous Carolina Windom brand has disappeared. And if you'd like my suggestion, I'm very high on the OCFs that are made by the Buckmaster company. The 3 of the OCFs that we use on field day, guys, are all Buckmasters. They're damn good antennas. They put out a great signal And really, to me, they're the ultimate generic field day antenna, especially if you're in a scenario about, hey, we're late getting the beam up. What do we do in the meantime? Get on the OCF and just work the easy stations. That's always been part of our strategy. These guys are good, but they are not cheap now. Their popularity has increased. I'll just give you an example now. John and I have talked about these Buckmasters for years, and John went ahead to complement our remote station, and he got himself a Buckmaster that covers 80 through 10, and I believe he told me he paid about $200 for it. These are well-built antennas. The guy's entitled to his markup, but I just want to caution you that if any one of you want to build one, I got the formula from the Yankee Clipper Contest Club for the lengths and for a much better balun that is used by the Buckmaster folks. They can basically put you on the air with the same or slightly better antenna for about a 30% savings. I really like my version of it, but the Buckmaster people, they do make a good version. I recommend you consider theirs if you're looking for commercially built one. And I'd like to tell you something very particular about them. I have a good relationship with them. It's a family-owned business. And I'd like to explain to you that the Buckmaster antennas are really good, but there's a hanging hook on the center insulator or auto transformer portion of it that constitutes the feed point. Whenever possible, you want to suspend the antenna from that hook by a separate support line. If you don't, and God help you, you buy the 3 kilowatt version with the huge auto transformer that's associated with the center field line, the odds are good it may not survive one New England winter. That model has to be supported by a center support line through the hook on that center insulator. As long as you do that, these antennas will last forever and they'll give you good results. The reason I'm so fond of the company is because all 3 of our Buckmasters are broken for one reason or another. But guys, nothing on Buckmaster. It's all us trying to do something imaginative with their antennas. And all that happened is the long portion of the antenna snapped in two. When I called these guys, I just said, hey, I understand that for the 80 through 10 model, it's typically like 90 feet on the long side and 45 feet on the other side. But what I've been told, sir, is that all of these OCF antennas have slightly different, lengths inherent to the configuration they've selected. Could you please tell me the exact cutting location that you guys use? And he goes, really, that's proprietary information, but God bless you. You said the club owns 3 of them. I'll give you the measurements. And he did. And guys, when I sat down and did the SWR analysis across all the bands, mine operated just like a brand new one out of stock. So I'm very supportive of them. But again, you can build one for a lot less. That's going to be a lot more rugged. If anyone's interested in doing it, you talk to me, and we can put it together. Now, I'm going to get into something that is not meant to piss off anybody who has made investments in any of the antennas that I'm going to describe here. All I'm going to do is just tell you that if your lot supports it, these antennas may not necessarily be the best choice. I will tell you though, for a lot of people that are not in optimal situations or want to keep things simple, they get you on the air, they give you pretty good results. But we are talking bang for the buck, so I'm just trying to give you some subtle distinctions. A doublet or a dipole should always be put in a horizontal configuration as a flat top, if possible. By that I mean if you've got 2 trees and you can both get both support wire ends up at 80 feet, right? So the antenna is pulled up to approximately the same height on both sides. You're running a flat top configuration, and that's optimal. But I will tell you, before the invention of computers for modeling, and before we had really savvy engineers getting in endless debates over antennas, we had a few gurus back in the late 50s and the early 60s that really screwed up. Because if you're a rookie and you pulled out the antenna book, they'd say, an inverted V is really a dipole where you've only got one support position. Now, that's kind of a pain in the neck that you only have one support position, they tell you. But the one thing you should realize about an inverted V is because it's slanted in both directions, you get some low angle radiation that will bring you some amazing DX across the sides of the antenna or off the ends. I used to swear by this year after year. Modern antenna modeling came around. More modern engineers took, a more refined look at the thing, and here's what they discovered. Don't ever put up an antenna as an inverted V if you can possibly avoid it. If you can't avoid it because it's only got one support position, I will tell you that same Buckmaster antenna that will operate really well as a flat top is actually designed to be operated in an inverted V configuration because so many people suffer from that one support point limitation and they want to use it that way. Next thing I want to talk about is the typical multiband vertical that you have out there today. Again, I'm restricting this to expensive, commercial-oriented multiband verticals. Guys, you could do better for your money. Nothing against the people that make them, though, because if you're a guy that is stuck in a situation, and I'm going to tell you about Morris's situation a little bit later on, in the presentation, where you've got no supports whatsoever, a vertical is a good alternative for you, and it's a good thing they designed it. They come in a couple forms. There's the standard vertical that does require you to put down at least a limited amount of radials. What you also see advertised today, though they are extremely expensive, they tend to be very tall, and they get the job done, but there's still nothing to wax ecstatic about, is the modern OCR or OCF vertical. And literally, that's another manifestation of off-center fed technology, okay? And these guys will give you some pretty good results without putting down radials. Here's what I'd like to tell you, though. If you could get a comparable dipole for that band up, pointing in the wrong direction, you would still likely hear incoming signals better on the dipole than you would on the vertical. And while it is true, verticals are famous for low-angle DX, I just don't know that these guys really deliver the DX the way they promise. I'm very skeptical of them. But now again, if you purchased one, you probably got a good antenna. And if you purchased it for the right reason, i.e. no available support trees or other structures on your property, you probably made a good decision. And if you're lucky, if you're a guy like Dr. Maurice is, you may get some superb results out of the antenna based on your environment. Now, there are a couple of you guys that swear by the next brand of antenna or type of antenna. I don't disparage them. For the amount of work it takes to put them up, they do get you on the air fast. They give you a reasonable good signal. But I'm just telling you, they're not the best return for your dollar, is the modern head-fed antenna on a multi-band implementation. Now, hear me out. Their ideal scenario is this. Hey, I'm stuck. I got one tree out on the horizon, 100 feet away. I got a windowsill that the wife will let me tie the other end and the antenna to. What do I use? Hey, a multi-band head-fed antenna under those circumstances is a good idea. I will tell you, though, that you can approximate the results of one of these guys, the multi-band head-feds, by using a solution that a lot of people used to use in the old days, which is multiple antenna tuners, including the two MFJs that I mentioned, give you the ability to just attach a single length of antenna in what we call the basic long wire configuration. Now, it's really not truly a long wire. A long wire implies certain aspects. All it is simply a long piece of wire attached to that red terminal that says wire on the back of your tuner. Now, guys, I kid you not. I could give you an A/B test, but for all the money that you will throw out the window for getting all the necessary balance and the 40-to-1 converters and all that stuff on an end-fed, you would probably get the same performance if you already got an automatic tuner by just stringing that wire out the window off the red terminal, saying wire. But again, if you're in a one-tree situation, you want to get out on all the bands, these antennas will work out. They'll give you a decent return on your investment. But if you got an optimal lot, I would just recommend something else. That's the way I'd put it. If you've already got one, you purchased it from one of the commercial manufacturers, they seem to be doing a very good implementation on them, and a lot of newcomers tend to like them. So again, not trying to disparage them, but just saying, a lot of circumstances may ordain a more efficient antenna than one of those. Now, let's get to a subtle distinction, because guys, there's a lot of ham-com antennas out there, or M-com antennas, that people rant and rave about, made by a company that's gone by a couple of different names over the years, LNR and PAR, and now subsequently I've just been informed that Vibraplex has bought out the product line. What these guys are single band end-fed dipoles with a transformer right at the feed point. Their advantage is they give you almost the same performance. I say almost, they're probably 95% as efficient as a standard center-fed dipole counterpart, but they're great for emergency use. Take a rock, throw one end up in the tree, attach the coax to the other end, you're on the air. They've got multiple single band versions, but I'm a backpacker. I think Andy has got a speaking acquaintanceship with the EFH style antenna that they put out, though I'm not sure he's ever bought one, that has a couple traps in it and enables you with just a simple wire that weighs 2 to 3 pounds to get on the air across like 20, 10, and 15. It's a great antenna. Still, special purpose. All these antennas, the single band models typically go from 75 to 100 bucks. A multi-band model will set you back 125 bucks. A lot of money, but still worth it for portable operation if that's what you do. I will tell you one other thing though. If you want to put up a stealthy antenna where you have the antenna feed point, which is most often the most visible part of an antenna, camouflaged by the tree that you have pulling the support rope up, you can barely see one of these things at the other end. You simply attach a very small insulator. Now, I've got a new neighbor, guys, so the ability to put up my 40-meter dipole may have just disappeared. So before the new neighbor moves in, I'm converting to an end-fed PAR 40-meter antenna I spent 75 bucks on. Why? Because the part of the antenna that technically crosses over his property, though it's on a razor-thin distinction between his lot and the lot of my other neighbor that loves me, he'll never see the thing is there. That's one of the other advantages of the antenna. But really, for the last part of this, I don't mean to be hard on manufacturers. There's a lot of specialty antennas out there that cost a lot of money. Fortunately, a lot of hams that come at the hobby that may be logical white-collar guys like me, for instance, might think like an engineer and say, geez, they charge 600 bucks for that antenna. It must do something. In many instances, it's designed to do something under suboptimal circumstances, and that's why it costs so much money. By the way, its ability to operate under those adverse circumstances may be a testament to the ingenuity of the developer. I'm going to give you an example, but please do not disparage this brand name based on the fact that I'm citing it. But guys, the buddy pole. There's several models of the buddy pole. They range these days from 200 to 400. If you are in a situation where, for instance, when we start doing parks on the air, all right, you go to a site where there's no trees to hang anything off of, you don't have any fiberglass poles or anything. These are self-supporting antennas on their own tripod. You set on the tripod, you put on the specific portions of it designed to support the band of operation, and bingo, you're on the air. The only problem is they're too expensive to use as a general purpose antenna if you have the lot size and the means to put up any of the standard configuration antennas I've already spoken about. But I can't tell you how many freshman hams have seen their buddy who's stuck in an apartment set up the buddy pole on the patio and then say, this antenna is the nuts. And he's talking to a guy that owns a residence with 2 lots to work with and a bunch of trees. And the guy hears, well, he knows what he's doing. He's been on the air for 6 months. I'm going to get a buddy pole. Oh, man, this is why we get back to the assumption of don't ask a ham that just got in the lobby. And no offense to anybody that joined us from the ranks of the CBers, all right? But if you got some guy that just came over from CB 15 minutes ago trying to tell you and give you good advice on ham antennas, the odds are good you're probably not talking to the best resource. Again, talk to me. I'll answer the questions. But getting back to that buddy pole, we'll talk about it. What are the optimum situations? I'll give you some examples where a buddy pole is justified. Pretty sure John Perlstein used to use his up at the Cape, but also in a couple situations where he's sitting on a sandy beach and he would swear by it. And I agree. It's a damn good antenna in that context. Here's another example. You have that ski condominium over in Aspen, right? This thing will fit in a shoulder bag. You want to just set it up on your patio without hanging any doodads off of anything, or off your front porch if you're doing a VRBO rental. It's a great antenna for that circumstance. I wouldn't buy it as a beginner's across the board's antenna. That's all I'm saying. I would also like to say something though nice about the owner of the company that puts out the buddy pole, and I've heard this said by countless hams. I can't quote his name. I just don't remember. But he is one of these guys who's a legitimate ham that's just trying to make a few bucks off a product that does cost a lot to make. If you were to call him with the standard appeal, like This is classic. I'm a recently discharged Army vet. I don't have a lot of money to spend. I'm kind of stuck with a tough configuration. I'm in a condo. I'd like to build one of your antennas, but I'll be because I really can't afford to buy one. Would you mind giving me a couple of dimensions? Oh, man, the guy will get on the phone with you, discuss what you've got at your disposal, and advise you on how to build for what you've got on hand, an approximation of what he sells to people. I mean, that's a good guy. So I'm just saying he's entitled to his markup, but that's a specialty antenna. Now what I want to do is just end the presentation by plugging in assumptions about lots, because we've been through a couple minor exercises, but by way of review, it's a great way to express a couple of the themes. What's my lot? My lot is 100 feet by about 55 feet as best as we can see. What do I have on that lot? An 85-foot oak tree on one side of the lot, and in my neighbor's yard, a scruffy, I don't know what the hell it is, fir tree that's approximately the same height that enables me to get my 40-meter dipole up easily at 60 feet. The only problem is the weight of the coax pulling down deprives it of a couple of feet. If I go with twin line feed, that's a lot lighter. 65 feet is easily done. I mean, it screams dipole. Then, from my huge oak tree going across the street, over into Scalzi Park by my in-laws for temporary use, it's the perfect angle to shoot into Europe. Again, I only use it during contests though. And what I tend to use is my go-to antenna is that 125-foot doublet fed into my 993 MFJ tuner, which tunes it across all bands. And it's so unnoticeable, my neighbor has allowed me to put up the entire antenna in her front yard. She and I have some allegiances on working on local community issues, though. That's what helps keep the relationship in good shape. But guys, if you've got a small lot, make sure you're friends with your neighbors and try to do them some favors. Then you may just get to use their trees. The next two guys we're talking about are polar opposites. So I've already done a site walking with Ilan. It was the first one of the year. He described it as, hey, I've got a few acres of land. I'm located up in Fairfield. The elevation profile is a promising one. But also, the house is more or less situated on what I would call a rough plateau with gently downward slopes at all possible takeoff points. And I can't remember the actual lot size, but guys, we're talking at least 2 to 3 acres to put up antennas. What are we going to put up at Ilan's house by the time it's all said and done? Oh, you're going to love this. Temporary plan I wrote up for Ilan, who's already purchased 1,000 feet of polyphase 13, which is that unbreakable copper-clad steel wire to get going, is it looks like we're looking at 2 extended double ZEPs to cover 40 meters, one pointed for Europe, one pointed to South America. Does that sound familiar? We're also talking about putting up an inverted L antenna to get him on the air on 160 meters. Now remember, those 2 EDZ antennas get you gain on 40, but they're also excellent multi-band antennas that are roughly the equivalent of a 135-foot dipole when you put them on the air on any other frequency and tune to that frequency using a fairly moderate duty tuner. Other thing, though, that we want to consider is he's got the loop. He's got the lot size to accommodate a loop for 160 meters, all 544 feet. Looks like we could easily get it up to 60 to 70 feet. This baby's going to scream. He's also got the possibility to put up a 4-square, the ultimate vertical, but that will be something that we might handle as a club project a couple of years down the road. And I'm going to be working with Ilan over the next couple of weeks, months. If anybody wants to join us to see a nice lot and antenna examples in action, man, it will be a lot of fun. The last lot scenario, though, is my friend Maurice. Maurice lives in a beautiful period home, and he lives near the end of Shipan Point here in Stamford. For those of you who don't know Shipan, it's a peninsula that juts out from the city of Stamford. And if you're at the end of the peninsula, you've got water coverage for approximately 270 degrees of the 360-degree horizon that's available. Now, because he's got a period house, a slate roof, and a meticulous wife, he ain't going to put up a beam, guys. And unfortunately, we're going to have to go begging to the neighbors. And Shipan can be a snooty bunch. to possibly enlist the help of a couple of their oak trees and borrow them for antenna supports. Sometimes if you're really swift about it, you can get them to agree. Anyway, what is his fallback antenna? His fallback antenna is a butternut 5-band vertical. Do I like those antennas? Oh, butternut makes a great vertical. But by the way, there's nothing in the world of butternut will do that a wire vertical cut for the exact frequency that it's currently tuned to can't do. In fact, you'd still get out better with that single band vertical. Why does that vertical work so well for Maurice? Maurice is working DX across 80 through 10 with this thing, which I think is about a 30-foot vertical. What's the explanation? He's over salt water. If you can run a vertical in proximity to salt water, then it's worth doing, because the poor ground considerations of the vertical that are inherent to the rocky soil we have around here are somewhat minimized by the fact that the near takeoff zone portions have excellent ground conditions for reflecting the signal back. He's got a perfect location to run verticals. Probably the only recommendation I would make to anyone for using a vertical would be to someone that lives in Japan. It's just one other thing, though, I want to talk about with respect to why soil conductivity tends to be so lousy around here. And what it does is has to do with is the way they build homes. Maurice has got a little bit more hope of getting some good soil conductivity than most of you guys, because he goes back to the days when Japan was first developed. Japan is a flat peninsula. They didn't have to do any huge bulldozing, right? You just put in the foundation and you do the landscaping. And if you were down at his house, you started digging down with a shovel a foot or two, you'd see some small rocks, but it's mostly topsoil. If you do that anywhere else in the city of Stamford, where the house has been constructed, say since World War II, on a lot that needed some manipulation to make it ready for construction, which almost all the remaining lots in Stamford are like now, guess what? You get the shittiest soil underneath your front lawn you could possibly imagine. I've seen them do this over and over again. What they do is, near the end of the project, all the remaining boulders and rocks they haven't disposed of or bulldozed to help form the basis of your front lawn, and then they're covered by a layer of miscellaneous foot or two of soil. Guys, that's the worst possible configuration for a vertical. Fortunately for Maurice, he probably does not suffer from that liability. In the end, the intent of this conversation is not to be maligning anyone's antenna choice. If you know why you bought it, you probably got your money's worth out of it. But if you're a beginner, don't talk to someone that sounds like they're a journeyman. Pick out the best guy in the club, and when it comes to being cheap, that would be me. There are others that know antennas, and again, over at GNARC, they got 3 or 4 antenna guys that could teach me stuff easily, and in fact, it taught me 50% of what I know. But you want the lot and the initial design configuration to be done by someone who's done it before, so they can identify the easy and expensive and efficient part first, and then recommend the specialized solutions for anything that remains from there. Now, again, you want help, all you got to do is, first off, just get on the mailing list, or not the mailing list, but the waiting list. Also make certain you paid your dues. Thank you very much. I hope you found this valuable. I will tell you, it's been tough watching the price increases lately. The only good news is my checkbox is so full of crap that I can't really justify buying anything in the short term. I do have hopes, guys, that the inflation that's been as high as 30% on some of these retail products will stabilize a year or two down the road. So if you were thinking of buying equipment in advance for an antenna you're going to build in a year or two, guys, I would just wait in the short term. Anyway, that's the presentation, guys. I hope you found it valuable. If you've got some follow-up questions, I'll be happy to start.
Thank you, Terry.